comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Yeshitela, and I am the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. And I really just want to be self-critical for the delays in starting late, but I appreciate everybody who has tuned in with us thus far. Thank you for sticking with us. Today's study is a continuation of the history of the African People's Socialist Party, which we've made into a special series due to the importance of laying out our history that spans over 4 decades. In the last study, we discussed solving the problems of the revolution, the 70s era, where we saw a transformation of the revolutionary struggle with the advancement of our theory, African internationalism, that went on to answer critical questions plaguing the Black liberation movement. This leads us to today's discussion, Black Power on the Rise, talking about the 80s with Chairman Omali Yeshitela, leader and founder of the African People's Socialist Party and Ahura movement, Bakri Olatunji, member of the African People's Socialist Party located in Oakland, California, and Comrade Penny Hess, chairwoman of the African People's Solidarity Committee. During this era, we saw some of the party's most defining political campaigns scorch the earth, constantly struggling to win the masses back to the revolution. This decade, as all of them were, was a critical one for the development of our worldwide African working class-led revolution, and this morning, we will hear from forces that were there during this time to make it all happen, and who are still fighting as a part of this movement today. During the discussion, we ask that you engage and ask questions directed at any of the participants. This discussion today should remind us of the amount of work that has gone into bringing us where we are today, which is one step closer to freedom. This party is impenetrable. It has never missed a beat. It has been consistent since its founding. It is the only one of its kind and the only one capable of leading the people to victory. It is my honor now to turn it over to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who will open up this discussion for us today. Uhuru, Chairman.
Ahura, comrades. I want to again express appreciation for everybody who's come on to this discussion, the study that we're going to be doing today, and a self-criticism for the delay. Comrade Director Akile Anai just mentioned that, and we're apologetic, self-critical for that, but there are some technical issues that we're constantly battling. We don't own and control much of the process that allows us to have this discussion with you, and therefore we're subject to whatever whims of the ruling class institutions that we have to utilize. And so I want to welcome everybody and offer self-criticism, and then I also want to really express a kind of glee, joy at being able to disappoint everybody who's an enemy to the revolution and the party, who assumed that the delay that we had meant that we were not going to be here. We are here. This study is that we're doing, and the way we're doing this study is based on certain kinds of contradictions that we are aware of and that do not get spoken of that often when we talk about the African Revolution. The African Revolution has been one of the most difficult processes that humankind has ever had to face. You're talking about, in the first place, a forcibly dispersed nation, a nation that has been dispersed at gunpoint, a whole continent of people that came under captivity, and the continent held simply for the purpose of breeding Africans who would be taken into slavery to produce and reproduce life for white people, for what came to be known as Europe, and was a fundamental component of the process that gave birth to white people, to Europe, what have you, at the expense of the identity and unity of African people worldwide. And as the entire African continent and African people worldwide were controlled by, and up to now, for the last at least 500 years, after having been under assault for more than 600 years by Europe alone, we have a situation where Africans, even what we think and how we think it, is something that responds not immediately and directly to the aspirations and interests of African people, but to the aspirations and interests of European powers. whether it's been France, whether it's been Germany, whether it's been the United States or Australia, whether it has been Belgium or any of these other places, Portugal, we find ourselves locked into a reality and a definition of our reality that has come from other sources. So part of the entire struggle that we're involved in is one that Comrade Amilcar Cabral, who was the leader of the African Independence Party for Guinea and Cape Verde, he talked about how colonialism took African people out of history, and that the revolutionary project that we're involved in is one to put ourselves back in history. And that's not a minor statement. And I look at our situation around the world and here in the United States from where we are broadcasting, and see that we are confronted with some of the same profound kind of contradictions in terms of building a revolution. And I'm looking at one of the real big contradictions is the question of revolutionary theory. It's not the question of whether we got smart people who can talk. We see a lot of that, but Karl Marx once correctly said that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And so we have all these people who can so cleverly interpret the world from their perspective, but you can test the validity of what it is they have to say by whether or not there's anything that what they say and their interpretation that contributes to our being able to change the world. And unfortunately, you don't see much of that. And so we see most of the people who we communicate with are people who are very well educated, who have been trained by our oppressors. And this is not just people coming from African petty bourgeois organizations, but even revolutionary organizations. That's been the case. And one of the major shortcomings of our revolutionary project has been the question of the development of revolutionary scientific theory. If you don't have your own revolutionary theory, when I say your own in this instance, I'm not just talking about black people have to have a theory, white people have to have a theory, and Mexicans have to have a theory. I'm saying that a theory that speaks to the condition of Africans as a colonized subject people who can only be liberated through the power of the African working class and the unification of the entire Africa and the African nation. And various peoples around the world suffer more or less from the same contradiction, but the problem is that most of the time those who try to define the way forward, if they even consider moving forward, sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie. If you don't have your own worldview, if your worldview is one that's tethered to one or another or all of the imperialist powers, then what happens is you borrow your worldview from your oppressors. And sometimes it seems like it's really radical. For example, there are some black nationalists who are radically and rabidly anti-white. And that's part of what I mean, is that we have a situation where the oppressor has defined the conditions of African people based on the fact that we are black and that they are white. And we are trapped with that understanding, and it doesn't give us the ability to define the depth and the basis of this contradiction, this relationship that exists between white people, black people, workers, and etc. It leaves us defenseless in the face of a Barack Hussein Obama or some other African who claims to be working in the interests of African people, or sometimes they're directly in the employ of the CIA and other kinds of intelligence organizations. We remember how just within the last 15, 20 years or so, perhaps less than that, there was a move to attend a meeting that was happening in Barbados, where a lot of Africans were coming together to discuss building some kind of international African organization, and were confronted with the fact that that there were Cuban translators in the meeting, and these Cubans were not the gusanos, the worms, the traitors, the ones who betrayed the revolution and escaped Cuba, but they were tied to Cuba as a part of the revolutionary project. And there was these nationalists who were opposed to the Cuban presence because the Cubans were white, on the one hand. But on the other hand, they had traveled from England with an African who told them that he worked for the British government, that he was sent to this all-black conference by the British government. So they allowed the African who worked for England, worked against the revolution, to attend the meeting, and successfully made it impossible for the Cuban interpreters to sit in the meeting because they were white. But the Cubans represented the only force that fought in Grenada when the United Nations, when the United States attacked Grenada and overthrew that government. It was the Cubans who fought. It was the Cubans who helped to defeat the South African regime when they attacked Angola and what have you. And the British were the forces who worked against the liberation of our people. But the Negro who worked for the British police, and he said it, he told everybody that he worked for them, he was sent by them, could stay in the meeting. And that's what I'm talking about, how, you know, we don't get an explanation just by saying somebody's black and somebody's white. You have to go deeper than that. So that's part of what it is that this is about. We have a fantastic struggle that we are engaged in. And revolutionary theory, the finding, creating, developing scientifically based revolutionary theory has been one of the weaknesses of the African Revolution for a long time. And we can point to certain forces who contributed to overturning that. And African internationalism, the African People's Socialist Party, is in the vanguard of that process of developing and promoting and organizing Africans and other people around a revolutionary, scientifically advanced theory. We're going to talk today about the African People's Socialist Party, as we have been for the last 2 or 3 sessions. And we are in Chapter 5 of the political report to the 7th Congress of our party. And we're going to talk some about the 1980s, which is important. And I will read too much, unfortunately, from the political report to the 1980s, speaking to the 1980s. But it's more than that, because it's not just about sharing information about what happened and when it happened, but there were living forces who were involved in these struggles. And there were events that were roiling the world at the time. You look at the 1980s, the era of Ronald Wilson Reagan, that bears so much similarity to this era that we're living in so many ways, with the exception that while Reagan did represent right up front a certain sector of the bourgeoisie, the Trump administration, who is engaged in many of the same kinds of antics because of the same basic crisis, started off as an administration that had to fight and continues to have to fight certain sectors of the bourgeoisie moving forward. But the 1980s was very important, so we will talk about that. Comrade Gaïda Kambon, who was a crucial force in our party during the 1980s and was a member of the leadership of our party, the of the Central Committee of our party for many years, unfortunately will not be here. We expected her to be here. She was to be here, but she is in transit now. She's traveling and won't be able to participate in this meeting. And I assume that even though she's traveling, she's probably listening to this discussion. And so we want to just say that we disappointed that you will not be able to be here, comrades. Comrade, there's so much of this rich history that you participated in that would be helpful for you to talk about. And that same thing is true of Comrade Omali Kefing, who played such an important role during this era, and he's in Houston, Texas. And Comrade Kefing has been struggling with some health issues for a long time. But when we talk about the 1980s, I think that on the top of the list of significance has to be the fact that the party held our first Congress in 1981 in Oakland, California. And that was monumental for a number of reasons, because the party had gone through all kinds of struggles and issues. We've talked about some of them over the last couple of meetings prior to then, but the 1980s with the first Congress that we held, that allowed the party from everywhere to come together, that allowed the party from everywhere to give legitimacy to all the things that we were doing by able to collectively elect a leadership, collectively adopt our program, to do it in public, to do it before the entire party membership, to turn the party organization over to the members, and to begin a new trajectory in the African liberation movement, certainly in this country and in many various other places where Congresses have now become a part of a tradition, certainly one that's been upheld by the African People's Socialist Party. And we don't just have a leadership that has simply put itself forward, and leadership that has come to be here because we've been in the trenches for a long period of time, but a leadership that has been endorsed, elected by the membership of the party, a constitution that to the extent that we had before, but now Congresses of the party has determined that this is our constitution. It's a whole new kind of legitimacy that was given to the party by our first Congress. And it took us 9 years after the founding of the party to have our first Congress, because the United States government, with the imperialist countries around the world, imperialist forces around the world, were functioning as terrorist organizations, had destroyed the black liberation of the Sixes, had assassinated scores of people, and we don't even know how many people were assassinated, murdered by the United States government. We don't even know today how many people were arrested in massive sweeps, how many people were chased out of the country. These, in many instances, were nameless people. There's some we know, and we hold them up to a kind of heroic stature, as we should. But the hundreds and perhaps thousands of people whose names we do not know and perhaps will never know were also victimized by this process. So it was brutal murder. And it was also the fact that historically the African liberation movement has not been able to last long enough to achieve a certain kind of political experience and maturity. The United States government, again, and other imperialist forces. I mean, how long did Patrice Lumumba last before they killed him? How long did Nkrumah last before they overthrew first and then killed him? The revolutionary forces have been victims of imperialist terror all around this world, and they've been able to do it with impunity. And one of the things that this reveals is the weakness of the so-called white left, white revolutionary movement, white communist movement, who in their own countries, in their own neighborhoods and communities have stood aside while their governments have murdered and assassinated and overturned revolutionary movements of peoples who simply wanted to be free and wanted to regain our happiness and stolen resources. So it was inexperience. It was the war that was being made against our movement. It was the ongoing remnants of the counterinsurgency that made it difficult, if not impossible, to have our Congress before 1981. So our first Congress was held in 1981. 1982 was singularly significant, and I should mention 1980 is the time where we had determined that we were going to make reparations a household word. 1980 was the Congress. 1982, the party held the first World Tribunal on reparations for African people that's ever held in the world. Up until this time, the notion of reparations was something that was held by a handful of mostly African petty bourgeois forces who were connected to legalism, certain legal approaches that somehow we would win the United Nations and somehow we would win the U.S. government to recognition of reparations, and they would sort of confer the reparations onto us. We talked about situation where hands full of people would travel around pushing legislation, trying to come up with strategies to get things in the court, to get the courts to justify it. It was the African People's Socialist Party that made the reparations movement a mass movement. It was the African People's Socialist Party that made the reparations movement a mass movement. And so in 1982, the African People's Socialist Party organized the first reparations tribunal held, world tribunal held on the planet Earth in New York. Comrade Gaida Cambon, who is not here, played a really important role in making that happen. And some of the people who we've come to know now, people have come to know as remarkable nationalists and leaders and reparations experts, got their start, got their beginning at this tribunal that was held in Brooklyn, New York, by the African People's Socialist Party. And some of them, historians and others who are activists, got their beginning at this. And we had to do this in the face of a huge struggle by Africans who actually organized a boycott of the Reparations Tribunal because we did not allow their great leader to be the main force that would be presenting at this tribunal. We had a situation where one organization that presumed to be the African government for black people in this country was opposed to what we were trying to do with the Reparations Tribunal because there were Africans who were from the continent of Africa who were functioning as judges. And from their point of view, that wouldn't work because the Africans on the continent of Africa owed us reparations too. Like somehow Africans can owe Africans reparations when all of us have been colonized, the whole continent colonized, those who brought out colonized, and somehow we owe reparations to ourselves. And so therefore, that was the most ridiculous claim, and that the president of this presumed government did not give us permission to have the Reparations Tribunal. And beyond that, the part of what makes this so crazy is that we had invited the president to participate in the process that we were using to build the reparations movement, to build the tribunal that we held in New York. And the president, the presumed president, came. He had an old issue of the Burning Spear, and he stood up in the middle of the meeting where we were trying to pull everybody together because we saw the reparations tribunal and the reparations movement as something that could unite the entire anti-colonial struggle of African people in this country. And so he stood up and he made 5, 10, 15-minute presentation in opposition to the African People's Socialist Party because of something that we had written that defined our differences with the Black Belt's new African politic, and stormed out of the meeting. And of course, that was our newspaper that was written in. We didn't take it to the New York Times or something like that. This is our view on these questions that were roiling our struggle. And political struggle is just critical to the development of our movement. And part of what we were talking about when I first initiated this is the dearth of theoretical development, the dearth of theory that cannot be enriched without some kind of ongoing struggle and debate within the African liberation movement itself, but they didn't see it that way. And so we had a locally based national organization that organized to keep the Reparations Tribunal, to keep people from it because their great leader was not able to participate as the primary force. This was not the presumed president, this was another great leader. And so these were the kinds of things that we were up against. And so we had the Reparations Tribunal, and following that day, following the tribunal, the day after, we held the conference to build the African National Reparations Organization, NRO, that took on the responsibility of organizing such tribunals throughout the United States, and did for the next 11 years or so organize tribunals in different cities and states throughout the United States. This is a part of the process of making reparations a household word, of taking it out of the closet and to the masses of the people so that reparations will be real. This is what the African People's Socialist Party did. That was 1982. 1983, I traveled first to England to participate in an international book fair where I took many of the books on reparations that we had published and distributed, sold hundreds of them at this, and then traveled throughout Europe, taking the reparations message to African people throughout Europe. And this is part of what made the reparations demand something that happened throughout Africa. And Africans from various places were contacting us to try to understand the reparations question. So this was happening in the 1980s. We opened up the 1980s. Then So there was a World Tribunal, there was a European tour, and I should also mention to you that during this process, this is just perhaps a matter of some interest. I don't know its historical significance, but I attended the first, the induction, I guess you would call it, of the Green Party into Parliament in Germany. I was invited to do that. I met with and won solidarity with the Irish Socialist Republican Party with the reparations demand. They held a press conference uniting with us. They held a press conference declaring that they did not want any resources from any Irish person in the United States that could not support the struggle of African people, that was in any way hostile to the interests of African people. And by the way, the day after I left, the government, the British government, burned their national office to the ground as a consequence of the solidarity that we had won for our position around reparation. African People's Socialist Party did this. And then, as I mentioned, I traveled throughout Europe with this. So in 1980, this general period is when we built the People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. And we built the People's Democratic Uhuru Movement first in Oakland, California. This was before NPDUM, either NPDUM or INPDUM, because we were coming face to face with the reality that it was extremely difficult to win African people as the party, Revolutionary Party, directly to revolution, with the impact of the repression, with the murder and assassination of our leaders everywhere, with the demoralization of masses of people, with the last evidence of revolutionary activity by Africans in this country being tanks in the streets. Some people just discovered tanks with Ferguson, but I'm telling you there were tanks in the streets in the 1960s. In small cities like St. Petersburg, Florida, and in major urban centers. They sent their 102nd Airborne into Chicago with Detroit. To crush the revolutionary movement there. And of course the military came into Newark, New Jersey. I mean, these were fierce battles that we had in the 1960s that impacted our ability to have our Congress, and that was influencing events up to this time. And you must not underestimate the impact of the defeat of the revolution, that it has lasted up until now. And the party has been the only organization that has recognized this and that has been working to overturn the implications of the defeat of the revolution. And it wasn't just happening here, it was happening worldwide, which is why, as much as we love various revolutionary expressions, of certainly various progressive expressions that we see around the world, nobody is talking about revolution except the party. We see in Africa, with the ascension of so-called independence, now a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie presides over governments, etc., and facilitates the ability of the imperialist state to extend itself to Africa through a neo-colonial relationship. Nobody's talking about revolution. As much as we love some of the stuff we've seen in South America, they're not talking about revolution. They talk about socialism. Socialism can't come without revolution. It's going to take revolution to make socialism possible. Only the African People's Socialist Party is promoting the revolution. And we see progressives, so-called progressives in this country, or so-called black left in this country, but they're not talking about revolution. They're none of them talking about revolution. And so they have great analysis about the problem, about the conditions, which are not so great and cannot be so great because they're not talking about revolution. And revolution can only happen if somebody has the instrument to make it happen. If you're not building the instrument that make it happen, if you're not planning to govern, if you're not planning to rule, then you cannot have an analysis that is meaningful, that addresses itself to the question. So we built PDUM, first in Oakland, California, and because we learned some things through that, saw that it was significant, and then took it eventually into Chicago to build National People's Democratic Uhuru Movement. We are the ones who rescued the legacy of the revolution as it was represented in the form of the Black Panther Party, because we were there in Oakland when they murdered Huey P. Newton. They killed him, and we were the ones who brought Huey P. Newton back into political life. The last political speech that Huey P. Newton who people claim to love right now. They didn't love him then. They didn't, and they can't love him that much because Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party were significant because they had the audacity to talk about seizing power. They didn't just hit the streets. They didn't just have great analysis and events. They were talking about seizing power. And that's the thing that made them a target of the ruling class, because they were organizing in the depths of the African oppressed communities for that purpose. So we were involved in the ongoing work to free Desi Woods during this time. We had this incredible Measure O campaign, land reform campaign, that was a fight against gentrification, fight against the whole war against our people to have decent housing and what have you. And Oakland now has been gentrified tremendously, and we, from the very beginning, we fought it. We fought it tooth and nail. We went up against, at that time, a majority black city council. We went up against, at that time, the Communist Party USA, Angela Davis, a host of other forces who were determined that African people in Oakland would not be able to control the land there because because of the petty bourgeoisie who were connected to the Communist Party, who were connected to the African politicians who were the Communist Party supported as a part of their strategy, all were opposed to this, along with the big bourgeoisie itself. So we took to the streets by ourselves in an amazing, profound campaign that people, need to know something about. And then we responded. We were the force that responded to the MOVE bombing. Who else? I say this literally. Who else? We initiated a campaign saying reinforcements on the way, because the way they killed and bombed the people in MOVE, it was clear that what they were doing was telling every African any place that this is what will happen to you if you dare to go up against white power. And they murdered those people, and they bombed an entire African community. It was a matter of severe intimidation that was imposed. And we held the first African Liberation Day mobilization ever in Philadelphia following that bombing, and called on Africans and the so-called African Liberation Movement from everywhere to come into Philadelphia to join with us, because this was crucial, because it was not just an attack on those people in MOVE, it was an attack on the African Revolution, it was an attack on the African population at large. It was an exemplary kind of attack where they dropped the bomb right in the middle of the African community and then watched it burn down and kill 11 children, men and women, without any response, again, from the white community, and without any response from the African Liberation Movement to speak of. But we went in, and we called everybody else to come in with us because of that. And of course, we were running people for political office. We were extraordinarily busy during the 1980s. I thought I was going to read some stuff, but I think I will not. Not now. I wanted to read some stuff because there's a critical question that has hung over the African Liberation Movement historically, and legitimately so. And this is a question of white people. And the question of white people has been really mysterious, mystified, to the extent that we said that it has something to do with God, either as Christians, as God, or as an expression of the black Muslim, as they were called at the time, Nation of Islam, that the white man was the devil. This was the explanation for what was happening. Another person offering what was supposed to be a scientific school of thought concluded that white people were actually mutations. They were not, they were mutants. All of this stuff, again, that attempted to explain the world, right? That interpret the world, but how do you change it? Okay. If white people are somehow a consequence of God, what do we do? How do we handle that? If they're the devil, what do we do? We wear all crosses and garlic around our necks and stuff like that. How do we fight against that? I mean this in literal terms. What are you going to do? Okay, the white man is the devil. Okay, that was really powerful at the time it came forward because of the intimidation of white people, and just to have Africans saying that the white man is the devil, that was really powerful ideologically. But how do you solve the problem with that? How do you solve the problem? White people are mutations. So white people are mutations. This is what they do. So you get an army of geneticists What do you do? I mean, so you spend time, looking through the genetic code and stuff like that, the DNA and what have you. Is that how you make a revolution? And we're saying that's not necessary. That's not how you make a revolution. I don't know anything about DNA. I don't know if white people are mutations or anything like that, but I know that after the revolution, we can set up universities to find out. But between now and then, we got to make a revolution. And the thing is that we've seen the Vietnamese, we've seen other people come up with different kinds of conclusions about what it takes to win liberation. We have to do this as well. That's part of what it was, something that we have come to understand, and how the party has operated and functioned. This is about the African People's Socialist Party. And the white people question is a really important question, but white people are people, period, people. And that because we can't deal with it, if there's some mysterious thing that, how do you deal with that? What do you go back to using chicken bones and stuff to, try to get to the essence of it? White people are people. And human beings are motivated by certain material factors, material forces. And that you get to that essence, and then you know where their power comes from, and you know what can take their power away. They're material, they're real. You don't have to read the Bible. You don't have to go to university to learn anything about genetics or anything like that. You can do this. African internationalism shows you the way forward. The African People's Socialist Party shows you the way forward. The African Socialist International, the worldwide expression of the African People's Socialist Party, shows the way forward. So I'm going to stop right now and allow Comrade Bakri Olatunji. He is on the phone in Oakland, California. And Bakri played a really important role in the struggle in the 1980s. In fact, it was Bakri who was a nurse and who called me and informed me that Huey P. Newton had been assassinated because he was brought into the hospital where Bakri was working, and allowed us to get to work right away to deal with that and to rescue the liberation movement and the Black Panther Party, as expressed through the Black Panther Party, because a massive ideological war was initiated right after his murder. The morning newspapers came out with a horrible attack. And we said in the African People's Socialist Party at that time, by the time of Huey's funeral, we said we will have the African People's Socialist Party, not the Black Panther Party, not the Black Panther alumni. The African People's Socialist Party will have determined who and define who Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party were. And we went to work on that and did it. And Bakri was there when that. Bakri was also worked with Comrade Gaida Kambon to organize the Bobby Hutton Free, the African People's Child Care Collective, that did incredible work in Oakland, California, as well as the time when we were building the free child care collectives to deal with the economic and social and political oppression of African women. Bakri was there for much of that, and much more that can be talked about. And then, of course, Comrade Penny Hess is here, who played a really primary role. And I cannot overstate this, the role that Comrade Penny Hess has played in terms of organizing, going into the belly of the beast, and organizing the white people to abandon their isolation from the rest of humanity, and given white people an opportunity to solve the pressing problems of the peoples of the world by joining with the revolutionary project and not being slaves to their bellies and this nonsensical sense of superiority that one would say would inform white people spiritually. I don't mean like the devil spiritually, but I mean that white people have found so important as a part of their sense of self and sense of self-worth and being, etc., that's led to this crisis of imperialism today that is often referred, where you see this thing that's referred to as a crisis of despair, deaths of despair, spikes in suicides and drug addiction and all this other stuff, because the world is changing under the feet of white people. Because everybody in the world who's lived under the boot of white people are fighting to win their freedom, and that is something that assaults the identification that white people have had for a long period of time. So that's important. So what I want to do is go ahead and let's open up the 1980s. And first, what I would like to do is to listen to and have you listen to Comrade Penny Hess, who's the chairwoman of the African People's Solidarity Committee, because the African People's Solidarity Committee, as you know, we organized that in 1976. So the African People's Solidarity Committee was in existence when we went in 1980s. And Bakri came into the movement in the 1980s. And so I'd just like to go ahead and turn it over to Comrade Penny.
Ahura, Chairman. Well, I just want to say, first of all, that I just have so much unity with the summation, the brilliant summation that you laid out of the 1980s and the significance of that period and the leadership of the party. That just captured it. And I do want to salute Bakri Olatunji, who is on, and also, yeah, it's too bad that Gaida Cambone can't be on, and Omali Kafing, who were so much a part of that era. They were just, in the mix of that in such a powerful way. And I just, unite with everything that you have laid out, that the significance of the party going into, which was once the headquarters of the African Revolution, Oakland, California. It was 10 years later or more, after that defeat, and going into the city that had been decimated by the counterinsurgency, by the impact of drugs and the police, and every possible front of the life of the African working class was catching hell, was facing just life and death situations. So the party was struggling on every front. And the goal, as you've said, was to complete the Black Revolution, complete the African Revolution of the 1960s, to keep it alive, to win everything possible, and to put the interest of the African working class on the agenda, to force it to be there, because a key part of the counterinsurgency was the neo-colonial strategy of giving a face of African power, but was in fact, of course, basically, truly puppets of the interests of white power and the relationship of the white left to that, which it grew up in, and wielded an enormous amount of power and still does in the attack on the African working class. And just that first of all, that this determination that we had to be, that the party and the solidarity movement, had to be on the streets. And I think that was a period of struggle that is incomparable. It was, I know that, when we talk about the 90s and we talk about the period of 1996, after the murder of Tyrone Lewis and the rising up of the African working class here, it was somewhat comparable, it was certainly comparable to that, but this was a sustained period of more than a decade of just fighting and winning on every single front, and that we were out every day. We were out. We were getting signatures for Measure O all day long and into the night at 24-hour grocery stores. We were, we were fighting against the police violence, around the housing issues, building the tent city for African homeless people in downtown Oakland Park, where they were fighting, where the city was gentrifying and pushing Africans out. the most powerful, renaming it Ahura Park, organizing a council of the Africans who lived there, which gave them power. 3 meals a day were served there, organized by the party, and there was order, there was organization, and the police attack on the Africans in that park doubled, intensified when they were organized. And just the struggles that went on around that, when the party tried to actually put up kinds of structures and tents for the people to live in, and was seriously attacked by the state with people being beaten and arrested. Whereas in Berkeley, anytime that white Berkeley wanted to do a tent city around something, they were always able to do that with the unity of the police. And, I think that, it was, like you're saying, the period of counterinsurgency when Reagan was in presidency, and this, just this sense of, of destruction of revolution around the world. And during this time, in the 1979 and 1978, the party was very, very seriously involved with members of the Sandinista Liberation Front who were assigned to work in San Francisco to build support among the Nicaraguan exile population there. And the party was just like one-to-one. It was such a close working relationship, and you were invited to Nicaragua, to Managua, after the revolution was won. And I think that was in the early 1981. And, as a guest of that revolution. So there was, it was just an amazing period. It was, every question from foster care to prison to police to housing to hunger, to schools, every question that the African working class was facing, the Uhuru movement was out on the streets making that happen. One of the things that
May I just
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you mentioned the Measure O campaign, which I think was an incredible campaign. And from time to time, I'm in meetings where somebody in the party would say, well, we passed out 50 flyers or 100 flyers, and they really think they've done something magnificent. But when we were in Oakland with the Measure O campaign, how many drops? We discovered this thing they call drops, where you work with maps and put a piece of literature on every house, every building within a designated area. How many drops? How many of those did we distribute?
We did 150,000 flyers 2.5 times. So we did 375,000 flyers in what is called the Flatlands of Oakland. That is not, we had this part that we were going to target. We weren't going to be in the hills, which is all white and it's almost like a different city. It is a different city, but the Flatlands, where at that time was predominantly African, Mexican, Asian, neighborhoods. And somebody, I think it was an African man who was a campaign consultant for that, said, well, when you don't have the money to do a mailing, you have to get your forces and go out there and put a flyer on every door. So we went back, we did it once to 150,000 doors, we did it again, and this was in 6 weeks. This was in 6 weeks because we started in September, and the election was the 1st of November. So it was an amazing organizational, it was like moving an army, because we didn't have cell phones, we had people out all over the city, everybody had their map, they were in twos. We would try to deliver lunch to them, so they would have to be at a certain spot exactly at that time. But it happened, the party did it, it was amazing.
And we knew that the Oakland Tribune, which was the bourgeois newspaper at the time, had a distribution rate of 100 or 100 and 150,000 or something like that. And we said we were going to at least equal the number of papers that the Oakland Tribune put out. We were going to do that at least once, and we did it 2.5 times. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing. I mean, it was the guerrilla warfare, and then at night, in the middle of the night, we were doing our own wheat pasting. We would climb up on those to the billboards, and people would have to, at 4 a.m. we would do this and keep watch, and then we would cover over the anti-Measure O billboards and put our own up. And and they would take it down and we would put it back up. And it was just, an incredible struggle, an incredible war. And to think about, that we won 22,000 votes. And this was not the white liberal rent control. This was dual and contending power. It was saying that it was saying that it was going to go by, the rents would be determined by the average income in a neighborhood, and there would be a resident council which would determine the housing and deal with the housing situations. It was like something that would be existing in Cuba. It was an amazing, it was a revolutionary movement. It was a ballot initiative that challenged the status quo in every possible way. And the governor,
The governor, everybody was against us. I mean, they even had dead preachers who came out, and this is literally true. They had endorsement by dead preachers against us, and the Black Police Association and the Communist Party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, all of them were officially against us. And the Communist Party said that it was too punitive to landlords. This was their line. This is the Communist Party USA. This is the Communist Party that fought Garvey. This is the Communist Party that in South Africa said workers unite to keep South Africa white. This is the Communist Party that led, whose Japanese members led the Japanese into the concentration camps in this country. And this is a Communist Party that still attempts to contend with the genuine liberation movement. But the only reason I wanted this to be talked about is because this is a part of the struggle of the African People's Socialist Party, and that the members of our party should know that it's about more than just a discussion, but there's actual practical work. It's struggle. We said when we were going out doing the Measure O work that it didn't matter if they came and they took our stuff down, because we were going to put it back up. We said, if nothing else, we knew we could outwork them, that they could not outwork us. And pretty soon, we put it up, they take it down. We put it up, they take it down. We put it up, it stayed up. I mean, that was the way we worked, and that's what it must be understood, that the party is not just about passing out a couple of flyers. It's not just about putting up a poster. It's about winning victories and actually being engaged in struggle, building social movements and what have you. And we, the African People's Socialist Party, consciously participate in keeping a revolutionary movement alive and building and reconquering a revolutionary movement. So I just wanted to intervene on that.
Yes, and there's so many other struggles. The whole question of reparations, building the tribunal, the first tribunal, which I was assigned. I had the honor of being assigned by the party to be the first part of the solidarity contingent that went into New York, and that's where Gaeta Cambone was, was the regional organizer of the party there. And and just being part of building that tribunal, which was amazing, just one of the most amazing experiences that I've had in this history of, just the significance of that. And that could be, there's so much that could be said about it, but we scoured that city and just everything possible, went to churches. We did go to, there were some churches that did support it. IFCO, I think it was, Interfaith Council gave someone, just different things that, just so many different places of support for that and really putting the question of reparations out. And I do also want to say that it was in the thick of all of this that you developed the theory of African internationalism. And you know, when I had the honor of being at the first founding conference of the African People's Solidarity Committee in 1976, and you gave a 13-hour workshop on dialectical materialism, but that was really African internationalism. That's really, it was the germ of African internationalism, because you talked about parasitic capitalism, you talked about primitive accumulation and all these questions. And so it was in the thick of these struggles. It wasn't in a quiet library and office with nothing happening. It was in the middle of, you know, various early iterations of the Uhuru House, that you were there with a little tiny office and just covered with books and papers, and that you really developed through struggle the question of opportunism, the question of white people's relationship to African people. And I would also say that a key issue a key consequence of the counterinsurgency, in addition to just the hell faced by the African working class and the attack on the revolution, the assassinations, and just, you know, the jailings, the U.S. government intervention, was also the lack of resources that the party had, because prior to that, at the height of the African Revolution, there were a lot of people who just sent in to the Panthers, and I think, and possibly even to Jomo, you know, just sent in money from $5 to hundreds of dollars. They would just send it. It wasn't even like it was a thought. I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't think that in the 60s that there was this thought of, we need this fundraising front, as much as people supported it. And part of the, you know, a key component of the counterinsurgency by the U.S. government was the destruction of any revenue streams of support. So to isolate, it was part of isolating that. And so this question was very, very dire, very serious for the party, you know, to be able to carry out its objectives. And it was really tied to this question of the development of APSC. And, you know, and this whole question of reparations that you were taking on, and at the same time, like, getting to the basis of white people's relationship to reparations, white people who have lived at the expense of African people. And you just wrote so much about that for the first Congress, A New Beginning and Bread, Peace, and Black Power, just really sharply getting to that question. And the African People's Solidarity Committee really developed and came up in that crucible of the struggle of the 1980s in the Oakland years, on the ground. And the party struggled with us just tirelessly, over and over again, to get what it meant for us as white people to become African internationalists. You know, and that is just so important, because you would assign us, the party would assign us to raise money for something. And maybe we did, and maybe we didn't all the way, but we might take that on. But we didn't see that as our permanent, ongoing, this is our relationship, and this is something, this is what it means to be under, you know, an organization of the African People's Socialist Party in the white community. This is what it means. We have to get to the heart of the stolen resources and to return them. And so, you know, it took until 1985, the middle of the 80s, for there to be a struggle inside of APSC, led by the party and by struggles opened up by the party over and over again, for us to come together and have unity as an organization, to have the struggle and have unity, that we are the African People's Solidarity Committee under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. Our relationship is to go into the white community. This is our task. This is our mandate. and to unleash the stolen resources to the African Revolution. And that was just exhilarating. And there were people that left APSC at that time, but the comrades that stayed were amazing, and just really had deep unity to go out and do things that we never did before. So we summed up, and I'll just say really quickly that it wasn't going to be a time, because of the counterinsurgency, that we were just going to be able to raise money by asking for it. That we had to build ongoing institutions that were institutions of the party, but for a certain level of time, it was our responsibility to manage those and to develop those under the party's leadership. And so we opened up Ahura Furniture in Oakland, and that was in around 1988, I think. And then we always had Ahura Foods and Pies from the early 80s, and worked to develop that. And these things are now directly under the Office of Deputy Chair Ona Zene Yeshitela in the party. And some of us from the African People's Solidarity Committee still have the honor of working in that. But it was it really took a lot of struggle. It took this time for us to be able to say, yes, we are African internationalists too. We are not. This is not a parallel organization. This is not a separate organization. This is an organization of the party with the mandate to extend the African Revolution into the white society. Oh. And that's what we did. And it's just been, it was an incredible struggle. And it was something, I could only say that it was exhilarating. It just opened up the door. Once we could really grasp that and see that, and it's been an amazing struggle and amazing honor to be under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party and the African Revolution, and see how revolution is built in the face of counterinsurgency, and that the party, as you said, the only force that's out there keeping alive the question of revolution.
Uhuru. I want to say that, and then I'm going to go to Comrade Bakri, but I want to say that, first of all, the African People's Socialist Party, from our inception, and even before the Uhuru movement became JOMO and became the African People's Socialist Party, always believed in and fought for self-determination, self-reliance. We built institutions. We went into orange groves to pick fruit collectively, to pick oranges, to raise money. We opened up a restaurant in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's a part of the whole struggle for self-reliance and independence. We had a bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky. We had a bookstore in Gainesville, Florida, bookstore and record shop in Gainesville, Florida. We started the first African newspaper in Gainesville, Florida, commercial newspaper, not the Burning Spear. So we always fought for that. Then we always were confronted with the fact, particularly at that time, based in a small city primarily, that is to say our headquarters, in the deep south, there were so many resources that were not accessible to us. I mean, we had to send to California to get buttons made. We had to get to New York to get posters and buttons and things like that, bumper stickers. And so we were constantly trying to locate the ability to get those kinds of resources to build our movement that was concentrated primarily in the South. And that was one of the reasons that we moved into Oakland, California, because there was some evidence of some so-called white solidarity. This was not the African People's Solidarity Committee that was there already. These were other forces that were there already. But these are people who had inherited the right to speak for the African Revolution, since so many of our forces had been murdered and were locked up in prisons, and so they became solidarity, working, as they said, under the leadership of the black revolution, while in fact they were the black revolution that were able to hide behind some relationship with some Africans who were in prison. And some of whom were in prison never were part of the liberation movement, but they adopted they became these fronts. We're talking about a time where assassination attempt was made in San Francisco. Someone fired a high-powered rifle into the building, and it's only because of really alert sister who was in the party had forced them to close a particular door through which the shot was supposed to have come, that forced them to find another place to shoot into that made it ineffective. My house was firebombed with an obvious attempt to kill me, my children, my family, and what have you. We were attacked by gangsters who were connected to Prayer Fire Organizing Committee, so-called white left, so-called white solidarity-based movement that was riddled with all kinds of agents who, over periods of time, were constantly being exposed as agents in that organization that led to the arrest of many of them. These were forces that were connected to what would be known as the Weather Underground at a particular time. And this is not a condemnation of the Weather Underground as such. That wouldn't be the basis of my condemnation of the Weather Underground. I'm just saying they had that connection with the Weather Underground. They were SDS based, such as forces also like the Revolutionary Union that became the Revolutionary Communist Party and other forces. They were all tied like to that kind of process. So these were whites who had inherited the right to speak for African people with the defeat of the revolution, and at the moment that was challenged, then they were able to successfully unleash gunmen who literally came with guns to attack us, resulting finally in the murder of Fleta Drumgo, who was somebody who worked with Comrade George Jackson in the prison system, led to an attempted assassination of a lawyer, a woman, Faye Stender, a white woman who they came into her house while she was in her bed and made her write a letter saying that she had betrayed George Jackson, when in fact she was one of the few lawyers that would defend George, and Huey P. Newton and others like that shot her, that paralyzed her and what have you. We saw some of the documents through Freedom of Information Acts that showed how the government was working through the whole the so-called prison movement. And there were people who were being killed at that time all over the Bay Area of California who were associated with that. So this was a part of this era and period, and people must understand, this is part of what we were contending with at the moment. There was a place where we wrote about how, 188, how the Reagan administration, like I said, there was really important thing that was happening with the Reagan administration, and how they really initiated the process that that you saw this leap in, I think, a 500% increase in the number of people who were in prisons in this country during that time of reaction that was led by Ronald Wilson Reagan, the noble president that Trump and Obama both salute with such enthusiasm. So these were some of the conditions, and they need to be mentioned. Some of the things that need to be mentioned, because people talk about the movement and the period and offer up great analysis and what have you, but we were in the thick of defining that movement, struggling when there was nobody else there, when there was nobody else there. I heard somebody who was on the radio just the other day talking about, like trying to, since the black movement is not there. And I'm wondering what black movement he's talking about. Like, there is no black movement. When was there a black movement? When was there a black movement? And we went through something like 2 generations, more than 2 generations of having to fight to rebuild this movement ourselves. And so I just thought it was really interesting. I want to say that the party's years in Oakland, it's like I just want to read this briefly on page 200. We say the period of party development and struggle during the Oakland years of the 1980s is an outstanding chapter of our party's history. The 1980s was one of the most reactionary periods in recent U.S. history when we took it upon our shoulders to complete the black revolution of the 60s and force the interests of the African working class back onto the political agenda again. Ronald Wilson Reagan had won the U.S. presidency on a platform of political and social reaction with enormous support from the North American white population. Well, North American and white, it's redundant. From the North American population. His politics, if we put white in parentheses, that'll be all right. But his politics and support were based on the revanchist assumptions of recovering the losses to U.S. imperialism in Vietnam, Nicaragua, Panama, and Iran, and the growing movement at the time in El Salvador. In addition, Reagan, who won much of his reactionary reputation as governor of California during the era of the Black Panther Party, was determined to take back the concessions won by Africans and other subject and colonized peoples inside the U.S. during the 1960s. Much of Reagan's enduring popularity revolves around his role in attempting to push back history and retake all the political and social territory lost by imperialism during that era. The governor of California at the time of Reagan's, and I'm going to say APSC, the solidarity work, the development of the economic institutions that you're looking at, this was the party. This was the party initiating an offensive in the white community against imperialism that went through one of the weakest parts of the international revolution has been the white community, not only here but around the world. And when you look at what we see happening with APSC, the founding of APSC, the economic work that they've done, it is a part of an offensive that we have initiated inside the white world. This is the revolution, black revolution, taking an offensive there, and that's what must be understood. Because when we talk about these institutions, every one of the institutions we're talking about is owned by the African People's Socialist Party. Every one of them is owned by the African People's Socialist Party. So people who have a problem with that have a problem with the ongoing struggles and success of the party, because at the time the revolution was supposed to be dead, what the party did was to take the revolution directly into the heart of the white community, and that brought resources and that brought contradictions for the white community that otherwise would not be there, and that is why this revolution continues to live and move forward today, and I think it's important to say that. So we say the governor of California at the time of Reagan's presidency was George Deukmejian, who had campaigned as a tough-on-crime, law and order candidate. During his reign, Deukmejian nearly tripled the California prison population from about 34,000 captives when he took office in 1983 to more than 94,000 by the time of his departure 8 years later. This is in California. So the various cutbacks on social welfare programs in California were glaring in Oakland with its large African population and reputation as the former headquarters of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party had been the center of much of the revolutionary activity in the U.S. and other locations in the world, especially where inhabited by Africans. And so this is what we were dealing with at that time. It's really important for people to understand that. This was not some static situation where we just popped up, but there was real struggle that we were involved in, that we led, that we defined. And today we're in a place where the African Liberation Movement, whatever it is a consequence of the work of the African People's Socialist Party, much of which occurred in the 1980s, but throughout our history. Bakri, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Uhuru, Comrade Bakri Olatunji is in Oakland, California. I introduced him early on, and just a really important role that Bakri played. He worked really closely with Comrade Gaida Kambon, and he worked with the Bobby Hutton Free Clinic. He also, as I mentioned earlier, was the nurse. He was a nurse, working as a nurse in Highland Hospital when Huey P. Newton was brought in dead. It was Bakri who alerted the party. We were probably outside of the state and probably the first persons to know that Huey was dead. Bakri, you were in Oakland in the 1980s. Talk about it. Uhura.
First of all, I want to thank Agriprop under Akile's leadership for inviting me to participate in this extremely important discussion. I think it's really important to talk about Oakland in the context in which you just put it in. I recall that Oakland was a majority African population. And I think even when you talked about Duke Nation just now, that was part of the process of getting Africans out of Oakland that we see even today is gentrified. But the thing that really I want to extract from this discussion this morning is that the party was fighting on all fronts in Oakland during that time that you're talking about. It was dealing with the police question around Freddie Lee Robertson, things like that. When I came around the party, it was the Freddie Lee Robertson campaign. Around the prison question, AMRO we had started the tribunals for the reparations question in Oakland. As you were saying earlier, PDUM was started in Oakland as a way to deal with the counterinsurgency work that has been discussed here. That work was in Oakland during that time as well. I look at the question of housing and how the housing struggles that were happening there, even in the Ahura House itself, when it moved from one area in Oakland to where it's located today on 7911 MacArthur Boulevard. The party took on every single question during this time. And I think it's extremely important because we talked about the dual and contending power institutions that we see in the party today, that they were forged out of this era, out of this history. We look at Ahura Furniture and Collectibles that's still here today. Ahura Foods and Pies came out of this era. And I think it's fundamentally important because I was actually thinking about other things like Spear Graphics that we had in Oakland during that time. And Shango Yesu, I think, was a business we had during that time where the whole question of dual and contending power just was, for me, just extremely important in terms of trying to build out of that. And it just was a tremendous period. I recall the Measure 8 and Measure O. I think Measure O came 2 years after Measure 8, if I'm not correct. It was a similar measure as Measure O, which was powerful in itself. I recall being on the street. That was some of the first work I did with the party was to go out and do those drops, as Chairman and Penny had alluded to earlier. We would be given a meal, given a bag lunch. We would be dropped off in Oakland. We would drop door to door to door for hours. We'd stop and sit for maybe 30 minutes or an hour to eat, and then get right back to the rest of the day to drop. And we would meet at the Ahura House to sum up the day. And that was really intense political work during that time. It just, I think during those 80s, Oakland was just a hotbed of political struggle. As the chairman said, there was a black mayor, majority black city government, majority black city, but the party was the only organization on the ground fighting for the interests of the African working class. As the chairman said earlier, the party had its first Congress in Oakland, so I think Oakland, and I didn't realize how much Oakland played a role in it until I started getting out going to other cities. A lot of people looked, to Oakland then in the 80s, and I think that it's important to say that because Oakland is where the party chose to come after the African Revolution was destroyed there in the form of the Black Panther Party, and that since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the Black Panther Party went down as a part of that COINTELPRO attack. And the party has been the only organization that's taken on all these questions of the prison, of the police, of the educational system right here in Oakland, California, taking on the housing question. We built institutions here in the city that I've just mentioned, and the campaigns that we've had have been pushed back the state. And I just think that it's been a magnificent period doing the work. And I just really appreciate, just looking and listening to a lot of the discussion that's been happening in Oakland, and to realize that I've been a part of it as well. So it has just been a tremendous opportunity to reflect on the period and to see the significance of that period and the work that we're doing today.
Ahura, I just want to say some things more specifically about that, because I mentioned in passing Comrade Gaida Kambon, who had, I think, done a radio show or something. And as a consequence of her participation in a radio show, we got a donation, a contribution, I think, from a North American person or something, of this huge RV. What's that stand for? Is that recreational vehicle or something like that? What's an RV? Recreational vehicle. And we took that vehicle and revamped it and turned it into a mobile clinic. And among the things that we did with this clinic, we organized something like 40 health care workers, including pharmacists and dentists and you name it, who worked under the leadership of the party with the Bobby Hutton Free African People's Free Clinic. And we took this mobile clinic to the most oppressed sectors in the African community in Oakland, 65th Ville and what is it, 66th and 65th Ville, and began to provide free health care services for the people. There was an abandoned hospital that was on, where was that? On what?
It was a clinic. On
Clinic. 90th and MacArthur. And it was just sitting there. And so we went and talked to the owners. It was owned by some white religious entity, if I'm not mistaken. And told them that, we wanted to take it over and to provide free health care for the Africans in the community, as opposed to simply relying simply on the mobile clinic. We would open up this clinic. And they really sounded interested. And then they said that, well, we think you should name it the Martin Luther King Clinic. We said, no, we want to name it the Bobby Hutton Clinic. And there's some people may not know, but Bobby Hutton was the first member of the Black Panther Party to be murdered. He was murdered 2 days after Martin Luther King. He was murdered in Oakland, California. He was 17 years old. And when we said that, the people freaked out, and they wouldn't want it to be called the Bobby Hutton Clinic. They didn't give a damn about health care, but you had to make it benign. And from their perspective, King was a benign force that was quite contrary to any notion of revolution, etc. So they even went so far as to threaten to call the police to put us in jail, even if we picked up paper or did anything on that property and what have you. And Bakri played a really important role. Bobby Hutton's mother, Miss Dolly Hutton, was one of the persons who came out in support of the clinic, and it was just really important, a bit of work that we did. And another aspect of the significance was the fight that we had, ongoing fight with elements of the African petty bourgeoisie. It's a fight that we're engaged in right now because there's not respect for the African working class. And to build a revolutionary movement that assumes that African working class people will actually have the power in these communities where we live and be able to determine our own fate and future is something that many of the Negro intellectuals cannot wrap their brain around or cannot offer any kind of solidarity with. It's one of the reasons they can say there is no black movement. There is no black movement because you don't have a bunch of PhDs and African pseudo-intellectuals who are in front of it. Instead, these are just ordinary working class people who've made these incredible kinds of advancements for the liberation movement, not only in the United States, but in Africa, in Europe. You see a movement as a consequence of the intervention of the African People's Socialist Party and through the creation of the African Socialist International. We cannot understate the significance of having pulled this together because this came out of the resolution in the first Congress that I mentioned in 1981, the development of the African People's Socialist International, the fight for the African Socialist International. And today, We've done a tremendous amount of work, and we are really initiating new struggle, enhanced struggle in what they call South Africa, often referred to as occupied Tanzania, and with one of the most important leaders of our movement there, Comrade Tafari Mugeri, who is the chair of the South African or Zanian section of the African People's Socialist Party. And we're winning people who are in our organization in Kenya and in Ghana and Sierra Leone. This has been ongoing kind of work by the African People's Socialist Party. No other organization has done that. And this is the organization of the African working class, which is why it is very difficult for anybody to get it. And they can only see political struggle as something that happens within the so-called Congressional Black Caucus or some kind of electorally connected process, and the assumption that somehow the Africans living in housing projects and who are the brunt of all the terror in our communities that we can write about and we can do analysis of, but cannot see as actually being organized to lead this struggle. The assumption that somehow this sector of the African population is going to make this revolution is something that many people cannot grapple with, but this is what the party has understood for a long time, and that was reflected also in the struggle in Oakland. In the struggle in Oakland, this party had to fight the Communist Party and Angela Davis, that so beloved by so many people around the world because they don't know. This party had to fight Ronald Dellums, beloved leftist, because Ronald Dellums, who stood up in the Congress of the United States and literally cried tears when he was fighting to get reparations to be granted under the Reagan administration to the Japanese, because his Japanese friend, when he was a child, was stuck into a concentration camp but could not support the demand for reparation of African people because his supporters are mostly white liberals who lived in the Bay Area there. This party had to fight these forces, and this is what happened concretely on the ground, that the African People's Socialist Party, to represent the African working class, who could recognize that this drugs in our community was a war on our people because it attacked the African working class, where many sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie, nationalists, etc., were able to condemn the people because of this, because it was the African working class, and that's who we recognize as central to any revolutionary movement, the party led around the struggle of counterinsurgency that has not even been acknowledged. I'm talking about the counterinsurgency has not even been acknowledged by none of these forces even up to now. Who call themselves revolutionaries and these great intellects and what have you, who cannot explain what happened to the black revolution of the 1960s or what they call the black movement. Anyway. Uhuru, yes, Penny.
Ahura, Chairman, and I just really want to appreciate the things that Bakri had raised, but also, I just want to say that this was a revolutionary movement, and the chairman was and is the general. Because, there might be, in some ways, it might be easier to fight the revolution in a time when there is a mass movement and you can just have constant recruits coming in and there are people who support it that are giving resources. But you had to go on the ground. This wasn't the result of a mass movement that the party interjected into. This movement was built by the party and the leadership of the chairman. And then so you had all of this in Oakland, the Bay Area, and the front in the white community as well, as you talked about.
And the Palestinians.
Right.
And the Nicaraguans, exactly. and the
going
Iranians.
To England, and opening up a front in New York to build the tribunal and the question of reparations, going to London and going to all around to fight for the question of reparations and the question of the African Socialist International in that period, and also keeping, and building the relationships on the continent, putting forward the question of what the African Socialist International is, building the theory, producing the Burning Spear, just every possible thing that you directed and coordinated and still do, that was essential, that no other organization could have done. No other organization could have done that or even tried to do it. This was the party, this was the leadership of the chairman, and it was an incredible period that resulted in the foundation that the party has today, you know, with 20-something institutions, organization all over the world, you know, just the whole history, everything that is the infrastructure of the African People's Socialist Party was forged in that period in hell. You know, it was because it was not the period. It was a period of counterinsurgency. Even the ideas were crushed.
Yeah.
And the forces, the population, the African working class in Oakland was extremely demoralized, extremely beaten down by what had happened to it by the US government and the neo-colonialists and white left, and the party just fought. It was just a fighting stand. Even in Florida, and the Iranians, and you know, just everything, that whole struggle that you talked about last week, just the fight, every front in Kentucky and Georgia, I mean, all over where the party was building.
And we had to fight
amazing.
White reaction. Here's the Iranians. There was no white left out there. When the Iranians came under attack in this country, and after the siege of that nest of spies in Tehran, and not just Iranians, but Arabs, Sikhs, who were anything with a turban, etc. You know, white people were sometimes killing them. They were having popular rallies on the most significant university in the state of Florida, the University of Florida. You know, with "Sand Niggers Go Home," "Send the Klan to Iran." This is the intellectual center of the ruling class that this kind of stuff was happening. It was the party who stepped up. It was the party who defended the Iranian people against U.S. imperialism. It was the party that was attacked by thugs, white thugs, thousands of them that attacked our mobilization, what have you. And it was the black preachers and black leadership that called on black people not to come out with the party when we were doing this. In every instance, we haven't just had to fight white reaction, but we had to fight reaction in the African community as well. And sometimes it was not the obvious suspects. I mean, for example, I mentioned, you know, I think last week when the 1979, or it would have been 79, I think, when the march that we had in Gainesville, the first one was unsuccessful because the white people attacked it and they tore up the red, black, and green flag and made international news. And we're getting called from New York nationalists about why we working with the Iranians because they white too. I mean, this is so stupid, such a sanity, you know, I mean, asininity, you know, it's mind-boggling today. And this is the stuff that we have to overcome while we're having this discussion today, to give confidence, you know, like to African internationalists everywhere, to give confidence about the grand, glorious history of this party and the revolutionary movement of African people that's unfolding right beneath the feet of the imperialists. This is what we are building in South Africa and all over the continent of Africa and all over the world where African people are. African internationalism is prevailing, and we are getting organized, and the people are going to move to take back our freedom. We shall never live as slaves again, because we're going to be organized to make sure it doesn't happen. We're going to recapture our own power under the leadership of the African working class in the interest of the African revolution that's connected with the revolutionary project of peoples all around the world. Do you want to see if there's anybody who wants to join this discussion by now? Uhuru.
Uhuru, first, can we just give a round of applause to our amazing participants? And this profound, you know, just discussion around the history of the party and the 80s and all of that, all the tremendous work that has happened, and you'd almost think, how could all of this work happen in a decade? And we do have questions and comments online, and also we want to open it up for anyone who's in the room. On YouTube, we have Panther, I believe it's supposed to be say Panther first. Uhuru Chairman, there is a popular line being promoted by popular black conscious social media influencers, and then lists a couple names like Breaking Down / Yvette Carnell, Tone Talks, Tariq Nasheed, Dr. Claude Anderson, which asserts history is anchored in America. In fact, some of them even go so far as to make ahistorical claims that black people came to North America before the indigenous people who came across the Bering Strait. But at a minimum, they would claim that no one is more American than black people because we fought in every war the country has ever been in, and because a black man was the first to die in the American Revolution. Could you offer an explanation of why this frivolous and spurious ideological current is so attractive to young Africans who are new to political life, who have not yet come into contact with African internationalism?
I think it's so attractive because it appears to offer some kind of explanation that is separate from the mainstream. I mean, anything that suggests strength and power and influence and by African people is attractive to them. And it's a petty bourgeois, nonsensical kind of politics. It's not nonsensical, but it's simply because it can influence people and misdirect people. And this whole U.S. American-centric kind of politic is defensive imperialism. Because America came into existence at the expense of the people who they say are not significant, who are the indigenous people, and at the expense of Africa. Africans are part of, obviously, the African Revolution, but we're also part of the revolution of the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I'm talking about the peoples who occupied and did occupy this land historically. And African people, there's an argument that can be made and is made, I think, legitimately. I was just in Mexico just recently, and we went to the Mayan ruins, and the Mayans are considered to be like the first peoples here. And there's an assumption that they crossed the Bering Strait. But the Mayan who was leading the tour when we went to the Mayan ruins acknowledged that the Olmec, people referred to as Olmec, they're not, but black people, is the mother culture. So, okay, but this government, this country, white people, Europe, did not attack black people to take over this land. They attacked the indigenous people, the so-called Indians. That's where they took the land over, and the people who are in this land suffer as a consequence of that. And then, of course, we suffer as a consequence of the attack on Africa that brought us to this land, and in a process that was part and parcel of the war that was made against the indigenous peoples that's here. So that's the way that happened. And you can't solve this problem that we have by claiming America. The only thing you do when you claim America is support imperialism. America is an invention, and there is, this whole notion of Americanism is an invention, and people who hold on to that hold on to imperialism, and the people will be victorious, and we're going to overturn all America. All Americanism will be destroyed, and the indigenous peoples of this land will be able to reclaim their rights to land, their rights to the resources of this land, and they will do it in the company of Africans who will be standing shoulder to shoulder to help realize their aspirations, which are part of the aspirations of the African people as well. Uhuru.
And that person was Morty from Richmond, Virginia.
Uhuru Morty.
Uhuru Morty.
Do we have your membership yet?
No, but I'm not sure, but we need it. We need it. Jesse? Oh, you have a question? Oh, okay.
Let's hear first from the people, if there are people online who we cannot see. It's easier to identify some of the people here.
Well, we're still looking for them.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Jesse, Uhuru.
Ahura, Chairman, and Penny, I definitely just want to appreciate this discussion. Just doing recruitment into the party, and in the comments section, this is a very powerful and important discussion regarding the position of white people, and you lay it out in the political report. And as you've laid out right now, this is a particular strategy about material solidarity, not white people liking us. And moving the revolution forward, this is a very unique strategy as opposed to other organizations. And we work side by side with these white people every day who are in material solidarity. And our position is not to get them to like us. It's about them going specifically into the white community and taking the Black Revolution into the white community. And a lot of people online are commenting that, it's a disservice to us to give our strategy to white people and to sit in front of other Africans next to a white person. So can you just speak to, you as well, Penny Hess, what it means to be communist, for the party to be socialist, and what this means for even young white people to come into the African Revolution beyond the question of reparations, because you just came from the Days of Reparations tour, And you saw a lot of young white people who are won to the Black Revolution. Can you just expound on, what it really means as a communist party, as a socialist party, what that means for the worldwide revolution, not just the Black Revolution?
Go ahead, Penny. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that from the very beginning of the African People's Socialist Party, the strategy of the party has been to win everybody that can be won to the African Revolution as a worldwide revolution, and that has informed the party's work from day one, from before that. I mean, that's that kind of internationalism and what it means to be socialism, that this road to socialism is painted black, that the African Revolution leads the world in socialism, and that the party has always had the goal to win the African Revolution, to liberate Africa, unite African people everywhere, and to build and to win back the stolen resources of Africa, to have a socialist government under the leadership of the African working class, and to destroy imperialism. And the party has always wanted to take everybody with them that could go. And just in terms of the African People's Solidarity Committee, it is an obvious, strategic and political victory to be able to be under the leadership of the African Revolution. But on a personal level, it gives us life, it gives us hope, because we have been the enemies of the African people. We have carried out the violence of the state against African people. We have lynched, we have burnt, we have done everything that this government didn't even ask us to do necessarily. We carried it out because all white people, even poor white people, even oppressed white people, sit on the pedestal of the oppression of Africans. And this is what we understand from the party, from African internationalism. And so we're hated by the world. We're hated by it. We're called the devil. We're called, all the things that the chairman has said. People don't even think we're human, because what we have done and continue to do is wipe out humanity, to the extent that, that we could do it. And that that white people are looking for an answer right now. We want to be part of the world. We want to be part of the future, because this system is going down. And any of us who have an identification with that know that we're going with it. That's why all these young white people are committing suicide. But the African People's Socialist Party gives us the opportunity and the concrete, material way, not to just eradicate the ideas in our heads, but to actually be part of the revolution in the assignment that we have under the leadership of the leading force of the worldwide revolution, the African working class, organized in the African People's Socialist Party. And it's white people are looking for this.
Oh, hold on. Of course, the party's not trying to solve the problem of white people, not like that. The party is trying to solve the problem of oppressed African nation that's been dispersed around this world at gunpoint, that's kept in states of starvation, brutality, humiliation, just the worst kind of abject humiliation that we live with every day, who cannot know that our parents and our children will have any kind of life, or that we will live ourselves sometimes beyond the moment that we are talking about, who create all the wealth that you see in the whole white world everywhere, and yet are denied access to it for our own benefit, who have plowed fields and dug ditches and planted crops in a way that allowed white people to build and go to universities and get other kinds of trainings and stuff like that, whose concentrated labor concentrated in every computer, for the labor from the very beginning, not only of expropriation of value in this country, but Africans ourselves are expropriated value that was taken from Africa. And then not only were we taken from Africa, but there are tons and tons and hundreds and millions of tons of resources taken from Africa and the African world as a consequence of this happening. So all of this, and this is central to overturning a whole rotten kind of social system. The way people live, the way people view each other, the inability of many people, Africans in particular, even love ourselves and to love our oppressors more than we love ourselves. And that's kind of responsible in many ways for the kind of question or statement or accusation that the last thing was read represents. Because the thing is that if you are colonized, and especially if you live in the United States, and if you live in the imperialist countries themselves, you will find yourself sitting next to white people all the time. Sometimes you drive their cars for them and they're in the back seat. Sometimes you work next to them, you go to the same schools and things like that. But the point to be made is that the proximity that we have to white people is real. It's a real proximity that we didn't invent, we didn't create, but it's there. You can't say that we don't have proximity. So if we have proximity, the question is it better to be on the job with some white person that you're sitting next to, or in the university on the campus, or with some white person you're sitting next to, or to pretend that white people don't exist and to try to create your own little thing somehow? Is it better to do that than to win whomever can be won, to struggle for national liberation for black people? And recognizing, of course, in the process of doing that, that the liberation struggle of black people is critical to the development of a new world, to the emancipation of all of humanity. This is the critical question. And we don't say we want to be free and don't want anybody else to be free. That's why we talked about Palestinians. That's why we talked about Iranians. That's why we talk about Venezuelans. That's why we talk about Nicaraguans. We've been in the mix up and down the line here. Because all the peoples of the world suffer as a consequence of the relationship that we have with white people. This is a new relationship. It is a relationship that happens under the leadership of the African Revolution. If you got a problem with that, you just got a problem with revolution. We're going to make this revolution. We're going to win this revolution. And we're going to develop this relationship. But this is an affront. This is a new front that's been opened up by the African Revolution into the white world. If that makes sense to me. If it doesn't make sense to you, send me your plan. And if it's working, we'll adopt it. And I guarantee you that, because we have no stakes in being wrong. And you shouldn't either. You shouldn't either. Is there somebody else? This is Ben. Uhuru, coming up, Ben.
Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
I'm on Ben. I was listening in to Black Power 96.3 as I was working, and I finally made it here. But I caught the part where you was talking about Reagan, and all the other presidents, and they say they're for the people, but it's not always equal opportunity for everybody. So I think maybe I should run for president, but I was listening in, and I got a lot out of it. And I'm always tuned in, either I'm here or I'm on the radio. So, but I caught everything, and I want to thank you for the knowledge about the 80s and everything that was going on, because a lot. Definitely.
Yeah, I think the main point, you got the main point, is that it hasn't been any president that served African people. It doesn't matter who it was. They served imperialism, they served the social system. And that being the president will not solve a problem for us. It gives us a bigger problem, because if you're the president, a lot of people are going to think we're free. Just like they thought when Obama was the president. You cannot be free within the context of the system. Then, as opposed to running for president, we'll be running for you in a different way. We'll be running with sticks and torches and what have you. And so we're not even trying to convince anybody that your power is inside the U.S. government, the U.S. presidency. In fact, your power is held captive by the U.S. presidency and the U.S. government. So where have we come at, Director Akile? Let's deal quickly with what is the other question? Uhuru.
Uhuru, I don't know if you're going to be able to get this question answered in 3 minutes, but I just want to appreciate this study. This is incredible. This is Jesse Neville from the African People's Solidarity Committee, and I want to salute you, Chairman, and Chairwoman Penny Hess, Chairwoman of APSC. And in talking about the 80s, at the very end of the 80s was the end of the so-called Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I was wondering, how was the party summing that up at the time, and did that affect the work of the party at all?
Uhuru, I'm glad you raised that, because it's really interesting. As the Soviet Union was in the process of disintegration. When Gorbachev was the head of that entity, we had, for the first time in a very long time, a renewed relationship with the Soviet Union. In fact, the guy who was over the Soviet consul in San Francisco actually spoke at the Ahura House in Oakland, California. And this was the first time we ever heard the Soviets able to say that they did not believe in interfering as the previous Communist Party, Soviet Union had done. They were influenced by the Communist Party USA in terms of what relationship they were going to have with the black revolution in this country. And the Communist Party USA considered formations that were about black freedom and independence as some kind of something that split the so-called working class. And they were opposed to us. They influenced Cuba. Cuba at one time was carrying the Brenningsville newspaper frequently, and for a while they influenced Cuba. Cuba ended a certain relationship that it had with us, and other countries that were influenced by the Soviet Union did that as well. So that was a powerful kind of contradiction that we were confronted with, and that was due to the opportunism in part of the Communist Party USA, and then of course it had to be attributed to the opportunism of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as well. So that affected us, but we recognize that what happened in the Soviet Union that people were characterizing as the defeat of socialism, we recognize quite clearly that what we were looking at is actually a defeat of capitalism, because socialism has not yet been achieved in the world, and we're in the process of making that happen right now. Uhuru. Yeah.
Another round of applause for this amazing study this morning. Thank you to Chairman Penny Hess and Comrade Bakri Olatunji on the phone in Oakland, California. And thank you to everyone who's participated in this study. All of those comments and questions that came in online, we will have moderators in the chat section making sure that Chairman sees your question and gets back to you. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune in to Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspahuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Join the Freedom Mass Choir and Band. The Freedom Mass Choir and Band is an all-African community group of singers and instrumentalists that sing songs of resistance and revolution. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals both in person and via live stream and video. Sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. On March 23rd and 24th, join the African National Women's Organization for their plenary being held in St. Louis, Missouri. African women's role in the revolution is on the front lines, and ANWO helps us to understand this by showing its tremendous leadership of African women, heading important campaigns like Arrest CPS, the state apparatus that steals black children away from their mothers and places them in the hands of the system to be either abused or kidnapped by white people. All African women should be a part of ANWO, and this plenary will make it clear why. Visit anwouhuru.org to learn more about this event. April 6th and 7th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will be conducting its third electoral campaign school in St. Petersburg, Florida. Do you want to learn how to run for office on a revolutionary platform such as the National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination and win? You don't want to miss this school. With speakers from the BIB Steering Committee, including Chairman Omali Yeshitela, you can learn from the best. Visit blackisbackcoalition.org for more information on the electoral campaign school. The movement for white solidarity with Black power is growing. Witness it at the Uhuru Solidarity National Convention, April 13th and 14th in St. Louis, Missouri. Come see the growth of white reparations to African people and learn the role that white people can play in creating a future free of oppression. Visit uhurusolidarity.org to learn more about this convention. Pre-order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, at burningspearmarketplace.com. Pre-order now before the end of February and get exclusive features such as a color photo spread and an autograph from the chairman himself. This book is the political report to the 7th Congress and features a foreword from ASI Secretary General Loezi Kinshasa, as well as international solidarity statements from anti-colonial, anti-imperialist organizations existing around the world. Pre-order your copy now. If you're local to St. Pete or St. Louis at the Uhuru House, 3 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, the International People's Democratic Ahura Movement will be hosting our Black Power Sunday rallies, raising important concerns and community issues and organizing to overturn them. If you're local to any of these places, come on to 1245 Tyron Lewis Avenue South or 4101 West Florissant to learn how you can get involved and fight back against things like police brutality, gentrification, homelessness, joblessness, and all the other issues plaguing our communities. An important discussion we're having today is how you can join the committee to take back MLK Day right here in St. Petersburg, Florida. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch us next Sunday for the next Omali Taught Me Sunday study, which will be talking about the 90s. Thank you all so much, and Uhuru, Vanguard up!
Vanguard up.